Hey everybody, this is Ted Petru, and I'm here with a short Pandas trick on highlighting the maximum value of each column. This video was inspired by Kevin Markham, who posted a little video on Twitter asking for people to submit their coolest Pandas tricks. So this is a Pandas trick that I think you guys will really like, and it's a lot of fun. And it can impress your friends or girlfriends or wives or whatever. It's pretty spectacular. So yeah, let's get started. We're going to be using some NBA data that I found on Kaggle.com in their excellent data sets section, and I'll post a link in the description to where you can find that. So this is a edited version of that data set, just so we have a smaller number of columns to deal with, and took out the missing values. So this is NBA data. These are the most popular or the most common statistics for NBA players. You can see you have the year, the player, this position, age, team, minutes played, free throws, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, turnovers, personal fouls, points. So these are very common NBA statistics. Each line represents a single year for a player. You'll see actually there's this player has 3 lines, but this just represents the different teams that he played on during that year. So this guy apparently played on 3 different teams, but for the most part, each person should have a single line for each year. So what I want to show is I want to show the player who has the maximum value for each of these columns. So for instance, I want to find the player who has the most points in the data set, or the player who has the most assists in the data set, and so forth. So and there's a pretty quick way to do that, but we're going to take a little bit of a longer approach first before we get there. So the first thing you might think of doing is just simply using the max method to find the maximum value of each column. And if you do that, you can quickly gather that information. Now, all these maximums are independent from one another. So the person who scored 3,041 points is not the same player who grabbed 1,530 rebounds, nor is it this guy, Zydrunas Ilgauskas, who's simply the guy with the lowest alphabetical name. To find the player who scored 3,041 points, you can use something simple like Boolean Selection. So we can create a series of Booleans by setting it equal to the maximum value of that column, or not setting equal, but testing for that maximum value of, say, points, for instance. And so here, almost all the rows should be false. In fact, almost all except 1, maybe 2 if there's ties or whatever, will be false. And we can use Boolean selection to grab that particular row. So here we have Michael Jordan, who has achieved the most points in this particular data set, or this trimmed down version. And he scored 3,041 points in 1987. Now, we can do this for each other statistic, each other column, one by one, and which would be not a very efficient way of doing things, but you could certainly do that and get the maximum. That's not going to score you any points with your friends, I don't think. So a more automated procedure of doing this is with the IDXMax method. And so the IDXMax method returns the index where you achieve the maximum value. And right now our index of our data set is rather meaningless. So what we can do is set it to something more meaningful, like the player. So if we set the index to the player and then try to do IDXMax, you will get an error because IDXMax unfortunately only works with numeric columns. So what we'll have to do is select only the numeric columns, and we can save this to a variable. They're all integers, but when you put in number, you'll get integers and floats. So and then we can do IDXMax of this, and I can save this to a variable. And now we have a little bit closer to what we want. So this is a series now, and the index of the series denotes which of the columns we have, and then the values of the series denotes the player who has achieved that maximum. So we know that Michael Jordan has scored the most points in one particular season. Alvin Robertson has the most steals in one season. Dennis Rodman has the most rebounds in one season. Now what we don't have here is the actual values associated with these maximums. So it's nice that we have the maximum, but it'd be nice to show the values. So if we look at NBA numeric again and use our selection by the index, which is with .loc, we can pass this in there, and we'll get all those players. But what we don't have, unfortunately, is the one specific year for that player where they achieved the maximum. So this is giving us a little bit too much information. So what we need to do is actually create a unique index for each player and year. So our mistake here was when we set the index to just the player. So if we set the index to the player and the year, we'll get a nearly unique identifier for each row. Now we saw that guy who played on multiple teams, so but we're just going to ignore that for now since it's actually not going to affect our results. So let's go ahead and grab this again, and I'm just going to override our numeric one. And instead of player, we're going to select player and year and put this in the index. Okay. So now when we do NBA numeric and take the IDXMax, we'll get this unique combination of player and year. So the player with the highest number of points was Michael Jordan in the year 1987. The player with the most steals was Alvin Robertson in the year 1986. So let's go ahead and save that to a variable, and then once again we will use our index selector and pass IDX in there, and now we get very close to what we want. Now what we see here, one little quirk here is that Michael Jordan is actually appearing in here twice, and that's because he's not only scored the most points, but he scored the most free throws. And it's not really necessary to have him in here twice. It's the same row that's been duplicated. So what you can do here is actually use the drop duplicates method, and that'll clear out Michael Jordan from one of the return values. So all that's important here, we don't actually care about this because we're the column names right here, because we're going to use the values here in our selector. So whenever you pass IDX in here, you're actually, it's not looking at the index of this little series, but actually the values. So you're putting in these tuples into the selector, and now we have exactly one row for Michael Jordan. Instead of two, which is actually necessary for our next step. So we're going to move on to our, and we'll just call this, we'll just assign this to a variable. And we're right here. So one thing that would make this even more powerful is if we highlighted every maximum value that was returned. And Pandas has this really nice style attribute, and you can see all the things it can do. You can actually do quite a lot with the style attribute to add HTML styles to your Pandas data frames, which are just HTML tables when they get displayed in a Jupyter Notebook. So what we're going to do is just highlight max, which is going to highlight the maximum of each column, and then boom, there it is. You get to see the maximum much easier. It's much easier to spot when it's highlighted. So you can see exactly where the maximum is for each player, for each column. So each of these columns, this is where the maximum occurred, and this is the player and the year when it happened. And so that's the end of my trick.